Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Elliott, Head of Communities with Dow Jones Risk and Compliance, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this first in our new series of webinars focused on risk. Each month, we'll look at the main risks in 6 corporate sectors, joined by an expert from one of those sectors. And this, alongside the new webinar series, we've launched a research series, also looking at risks in those same 6 sectors, drawing on the corporate filings available from our Factiva product. Today, we're here to talk about energy, and I'm joined by Christine Stevenson. She's Head of Compliance and ESG at Hartree Partners, a commodities trading and investment firm. Previously, she spent many years at BP. Christine, thanks for joining us. And I wanted to start by asking you about the broad range of risks that you're looking at. In our research report, we chose 5, climate, geopolitics, supply chain, sanctions, and cybersecurity. But how does that line up with the primary risks that you're evaluating at the moment?
Yeah, none of them surprised me in terms of kind of primary risks. A couple of them, I think, depending on how companies assess their risk profile, probably overlap a little bit. But, I think climate obviously is in the front and center for a lot of energy companies. And having spent a lot of time at an integrated energy company, that's long been one that people have been focused on, as well as supply chain. I think one of the things that surprised me was cybersecurity was 4th. I would have thought it was a little bit higher. And actually, there were probably 1 or 2. And again, really depends on how people run their enterprise risk management programs. But, I think significantly in the industry, there are some risks around a category called regulatory noncompliance, which probably is strewn among the different categories that showed up, but also one about talent. There's been a lot of discussion over the past several years in terms of within energy companies, making sure that key talent continues to flow into the company. And how is it that you compete as an energy company with tech, and things that are perhaps more sexy than reservoir engineering and things like that, but key talent. And also some of the upcoming departures from the industry in terms of the demographics, and how is it that you ensure that you still have that appropriate talent pipeline, particularly as the companies look to straddle the traditional fossil fuel base, but also the energy transition. So key talent was one that wasn't on there, which I actually thought might have been.
So the talent risk here is in those areas you mentioned, and also tech skills applied to energy. Is that what you were alluding to there?
Yeah. I think we've heard, and I sit in Houston, so among a lot of my peers who work compliance and legal and other risk functions within the energy industry, you hear a lot about kind of the fight for talent, because you're competing, in theory, with the Googles, the Microsofts. Even some companies have turned to kind of market themselves as, being more of an energy tech company and making sure that you're getting that talent pipeline to come in, that they're interested in helping with the transition. Again, as well as some of the more traditional roles that will soon be departing with an aging population in those industries as well.
Very interesting. We'll certainly take a look at that in our next round of research. Yeah. Climate, as you mentioned, was the most mentioned risk, but it seems to be viewed by companies in quite a varied way. Everything from the risk of owning stranded assets to the physical risk to facilities. Are there any risks in that big bucket of climate that stand out for you?
Yeah, I think certainly the physical risk. Again, having sat in Houston for most of my career and having worked for an integrated energy company, there are good processes and procedures in place for, hurricanes. But I think what we've been seeing more recently is the impact of the weather has been harsher than in the past. And so obviously from, investment in kit and making sure, and also, repairs and ensuring that your assets, can withstand the storm and get back up online, considerably more investment there. But even, and actually this past summer was an interesting example. It was actually early May. There's a lot more impact on even not just the assets that are, say, sitting out in the Gulf of Mexico, but where you expect, and you've got processes in place for managing kind of severe weather events. But we saw, for example, in Houston this year, I think it was back in May, the derecho, which took out thousands of windows in, the buildings downtown, right? So impacted, really having more business continuity plans to make sure that those are in place. Because again, while we all got pretty efficient at working from home, a lot of the companies have started to come back and, to be able to plan for, again, some of the companies, people couldn't get back into the office for several months because then there's also the supply chain issues in terms of getting the windows fixed and getting people back into the office. So I think, what we're seeing around physical assets, it's kind of the impacts are broadening and they're becoming more severe and somewhat unpredictable.
And I think perhaps some people would be surprised that climate scored so highly in these filings, given the backlash against ESG and now with the incoming administration and its favoring of fossil fuels. Perhaps some people would have assumed that this issue would have faded a bit. Now, the research in our report was done a few weeks back before the election and based on prior filings. But do you think when next time we do this piece of research a few months from now, is climate still likely to be such a prominent issue?
I do. I do think that. I mean, we will see what the new incoming administration does in terms of deregulation or perhaps deprioritizing things around carbon. However, for energy companies, they operate globally, and it's kind of a bit of a tale of two cities. I think that the focus and the regulation is going to continue to happen in other parts of the world, the EU, for example, the UK. And so, particularly as someone who has been in compliance now for the last 10 years, that balance of how to put together the appropriate processes and procedures to manage the different regulatory obligations, but also, I would say, the self-imposed regulations in order to make sure that actually you can continue to contract with suppliers who have certain expectations of who they are either sourcing from or selling to is going to continue. And I think it's going to drive probably a considerable amount of not necessarily regulatory complexity, but I think administrative complexity. We see a lot of things still coming in from banks in terms of how they're managing their stakeholders' expectations on who they're lending money to. Are green premiums still going to be available? So I don't think any of it necessarily goes away. I just think it's a larger pool of issues that we will have to contend with, and it's also going to drive to some extent. People still want EVs. I don't think all of that goes away. Energy companies might have more choice in terms of what fossil fuels can they source from, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to add a considerable amount of work, particularly for people in risk and compliance.
And it'll add work because of the divergence around the globe and because of the additional complexity that brings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no, even obviously, again, it's to be determined what the new administration is going to do. But I think the the issue for people in risk and compliance has always been that there's really no mandated standard. There are various aspirations, goals at an international level. Then you look down on a national level and then regional. And then you also have companies that, depending on their stakeholders and their stakeholder expectations, may redefine, again, who they're willing to work with and what their expectations are. So you're really, without that standardization, you're really kind of juggling a lot of different requirements that may not be regulatory requirements that largely will shape who you will be working with and who perhaps doesn't want to work with you.
One other thing that was apparent to me in working on the research on this sector is how much overlap there is in some of these risk categories, like between geopolitics and supply chain and sanctions and so on. How as a professional within an energy company do you go about dealing with that complexity?
Yeah, I think compliance actually sits in a really unique position to enable companies to kind of connect the dots, right, on these different issues, whether it's, the geopolitics or sanctions or supply chain. And I think, as I think about policies, procedures, we're in a great place to kind of help lead those conversations, because as compliance, you kind of see the company at a more holistic level. And it's really, to me, in addition to kind of understanding what the regulations are, which is the base, kind of the basics, it's also, helping executives, C-suites, managers, people in commercial positions to understand the stakeholder expectations. And stakeholders are both internal and external. And then coming up with a plan in order to react to that and address the various issues. I mean, I think about, as an example of kind of this multidisciplinary approach to things, if you think about when the Russia sanctions were first kind of issued in 2022, you had what OFAC required as a US company. But then you also had people taking stances in terms of, from a company code of conduct, ethics perspective, what it was that they were going to do. And you saw a lot of self-sanctioning that was happening at the beginning. And that a lot of that is a factor of these kind of overlapping number one requirements, and being able to be prepared to address, frankly, the fluid change of a lot of them that we've seen. And I know we're going to talk about sanctions in a bit, but that's one of the areas. And again, I think compliance, along with the other risk partners, are in a unique position to help, companies think through the potential implications and the right way to kind of plan for these changes.
So they're looking not just at the rules on the books, but also what other stakeholders are pushing for and things that potentially down the road could turn into rules and regulations, I guess.
Absolutely. And reputational impact. It's a bit of compliance, is around the optics and the ethics, in addition to what's kind of black and white regulation, being able to think about, well, just because you can do something like that, is that actually the right path for the company? And I think, I don't necessarily think it's a recent phenomenon, but recent events, I think, have forced folks to think that way. And I think it's positive in terms of the industry being proactive.
Makes sense. Geopolitics is one of those broad areas of risk as well, a little bit like climate in that sense. And I guess it's a relatively, it's become a lot more prominent in the last couple of years, according to various surveys of executives, and that came through in our research as well. How do you go about translating that broad concept into specific actions or specific risks that pertain to Hartree?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think it's very similar. You know, it's about taking the core values of the company, in addition to, you know, having the right access to information and data to help you, you know, hopefully be as in front as you can, upfront and in front as you can of, you know, these geopolitical changes. You know, ever since the election in November, obviously there have been lots of discussions around anticipation of what the new administration might do, you know, similar in other regions, but, you know, taking in that information, kind of lining that up then with the values of the company, and, you know, creating or putting forward, modifying whatever policies and procedures that you need to in order to make sure that you can be as flexible as possible in being able to respond in those potential changes. And whether that's looking at, you know, surveying the company in terms of where do we do business? What regions are we doing business in? Are there geopolitical sensitivities around some of those places? I think we're all anticipating in the US that China may be one of those. So thinking about, you know, helping the company think about, okay, you know, how much are we invested there? Where can we be flexible, and a bit of scenario planning.
Yeah, and it's interesting that this is a role for compliance, but I guess it has to be, because it does potentially translate into direct compliance issues as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And, you know, depending on how your compliance department is defined, it could manifest itself in regulation, but it also can manifest itself in, you know, kind of reputational issues. Again, I go back to the you know, the imposition of the Russian sanctions back in 2022. You know, there was an article, not about any company that I've worked for, but, you know, there was a cargo of crude floating around that was Russian origin, and it was a bit of, you know, it could be purchased. I think the company that purchased it obviously did it for all sorts of good reasons, but there was a lot of, you know, a lot of reputational blowback on that. And obviously they navigated that. And, you know, sometimes companies take that into consideration as part of their risk profile. But I think that, you know, the geopolitical sensitivities of that are things that we are probably more keenly aware of now due to some of these more recent events.
Yeah, it makes total sense. So you said at the beginning that you were surprised that cyber security, cyber crime wasn't higher on the list, as was I, especially as it wasn't that long ago. I think it was 2021 that we had the very damaging cyber attack on Colonial Pipeline. Any thoughts about the current view of cyber risk in the industry and how companies are tackling it?
I mean, undoubtedly, it's still top of mind. You know, myself personally, I think about it from the perspective of, you know, the cyber attacks are becoming more frequent. They come in different forms, and the people or entities perpetrating them, you know, are becoming more savvy around it. And it's really, to me, it's probably one of the most difficult risks to manage, because as opposed to geopolitical trends, I think trying to predict where they're going to go next, it certainly requires expertise well beyond mine. I can barely do Excel. And so again, it goes to the point of, you know, making sure that you've got the right people in place to help, number one, anticipate, number two, you know, ensure that your IT infrastructure is as bulletproof as possible. And, you know, to make sure that you've got an appropriate response plan to these attacks if and when that they do happen. And, you know, they're happening, I think, more frequently and in different forms. So it, you know, really is one that I think is probably, from my perspective, the most difficult one to manage.
And the other one I was a little surprised about was sanctions. That was, of the 5 big operational risks that we looked at in the report, that was lowest on the list. my impression was that that was probably a pretty big concern for the energy industry. In fact, I was talking to a head of compliance just a couple of weeks ago who said that he had doubled the size of his sanctions compliance team over a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think that risk is heading?
I think, the risk will continue to be there. I think the advantage perhaps for energy companies is any company that has a global footprint and has physical product, should be fairly accustomed to and should have a good program in place for addressing sanctions. I think, Russia, Venezuela to some extent, Iran's been a little bit quiet and, consistent. But I think, technology has probably helped us or enabled us to be on top of the changes, because you're getting notification from, again, various countries, various jurisdictions, but our ability to do that has been enhanced by technology, which has been a good thing. Whether you're monitoring the changes in the actual regulation or changes in SDN lists. So I think, becoming more efficient at it is probably where the focus is, as, seems to be the case with the person that you were talking to who's doubled the size of the team. It's really the resource around it that I think will continue to, to be the focus versus, the actual management of sanctions per se. Most companies, again, are pretty well versed in that.
And is it the case, do you think, that energy companies have pretty mature sanctions compliance programs when perhaps other sectors don't?
I do. I think energy companies, tech companies are another example. They've got pretty mature programs. So yeah, sanctions have been, a regulatory risk that energy companies have had to contend with for many, many years. And again, I think it's more about the efficiency and the ability to kind of take in a more global swath of varying sanctions, and becoming kind of efficient in ensuring that you've got the right information and that your program can be adjusted accordingly.
Now, one other risk we looked at, another broad risk, didn't even make it into our chart because the mentions of it were too few, and that is artificial intelligence. It's a big talking point among corporate executives generally, and including compliance executives. I know I've done a couple of on-stage panels talking about AI, both using it in programs, but also the broader corporate risks around it. How are you thinking about the risk side of AI?
Yeah, I think the risk side of AI, first and foremost, I think like any other company, we're all thinking through how best to utilize AI, because it's here. And, there's a corporate driver in terms of the, again, efficiencies that it can bring. Obviously, on the other side of it, around the risks of what's the governance around it, depending on where it is you're deploying the use of AI, how are you evaluating or surveilling the accuracy of the models that are being put in place? Are there privacy protections that you need to be attuned to, model bias, discrimination, and also though anticipating again how it might be regulated, because right now there are multiple layers. In certain places, there's not a whole lot of regulation. So in the US, there are a handful of states that have some regulation on the books in regards to AI, but there's nothing at a national level, and there may not be anytime soon. But again, we're all in a global economy. So, international, there are international regulations, national regulations, and regional regulations. And again, being in a position to, number one, understand those, and then change or modify policies and procedures to ensure compliance is something that, the team needs to be out in front on.
Is this another situation where the international picture is also very important? Because, of course, we have the EU AI Act, which is a pretty extensive, far-reaching piece of legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. And understanding how that overlays your business, whether you're a U.S. company, a U.K. company, I think, again, getting your arms around that and ensuring that, you understand how the risks of, the various legislation impacts your business is essential and will continue to be as those regulations more come into place, and things change.
As I mentioned previously, we did this research some while before the US elections, and now one of the big discussion points about a change in policy is around tariffs. Have you given some consideration to what tariffs could mean for your industry or even your company?
I mean, I think we're all, again, it's a bit of kind of wait and see. We'll see what gets implemented. Obviously, it will, depending on who the tariffs are levied on and what products, what industry, there's the potential that it can impact the price of components coming into the U.S. I think one of the other things that everyone is kind of waiting on is, whether or not there will be reciprocal tariffs levied against products, energy products that get exported from the U.S. How is Mexico going to react? How potentially is China going to react? And it's, a lot of wait and see, but, I think everybody certainly is anticipating something. And, whether it's beefing up their regulatory affairs teams so that they can be on top of these changes, or, however it is that they're going to get the information about understanding the potential impacts. I think a lot of folks in the industry are on top of that.
We'll be tackling energy again 6 months from now. Do you think at that time the overall risk picture is likely to have changed very much? Is there anything that could come along and surprise us?
I'm sure there's always something that can come along and surprise us. I mean, again, to me, the broad category of the risk of regulatory noncompliance, which is bread and butter to what compliance does, is you just don't know where it's going to be. And again, making sure that you've got the resources to enable you to be as, on the front foot of the change, is what's most important.
Okay, we're about out of time. Thank you so much, Christine, for sharing your insights with us. For the audience members, we'll be holding another one of these later this month, in fact, on the banking industry, and then watch out for the monthly series as well as the monthly research reports. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again at one of these webinars in future.